Hello everyone, and welcome to the HTML Beginner course. In this course, we're going to cover everything you need to start working with HTML. You'll learn all the basics step by step, and here are the topics we'll be going through. I'll be doing this on Windows, but the process is the same if you're on a Mac. And by the end of this course, you'll have a solid understanding of HTML and how it works. So, let's get started. HTML stands for Hypertext Markup Language. Now, the important word here is markup. HTML isn't a programming language. It doesn't make things happen. Instead, it's a markup language, which means its job is to structure a web page. Think of HTML like the skeleton of a website. It gives shape and support to everything you see on the screen. With HTML, we tell the browser exactly what each part of the page is. For example, this is a heading. This is a paragraph. This is an image. So HTML is basically the set of building blocks that form a web page. Just like bricks create the basic shape of a house. But HTML doesn't work alone. CSS comes in to handle the design. JavaScript handles the interactive parts. When HTML, CSS, and JavaScript work together, they create the websites we use every day. Alright, let's talk about the tools you'll need for this course. To write HTML, you need something called a code editor. This is simply a program where you can type and organize your code. There are lots of code editors available: Visual Studio Code, Sublime Text, Notepad++, and many others. You can choose any one you like and feel comfortable with. In this course, I'll be using Visual Studio Code, or VS Code. It's free, beginner-friendly, and one of the best tools for web development. If you want to follow along with me, just visit code.visualstudio.com and download the version that matches your computer: Windows, Mac OS, or Linux. Once you've downloaded it, simply follow the installation steps and you'll be ready to start coding. After you finish installing VS Code, go ahead and open it. You'll see the welcome page when it starts up. We don't need it right now, so you can simply close it. Next, we're going to install a few extensions that will make writing code much easier. First, open the Extensions panel on the left side of VS Code. In the search bar at the top, type Prettier. You should see an extension called Prettier Code Formatter. Click Install. Prettier helps keep our code clean and organized by automatically formatting it for us. On my computer, it's already installed. Now, let's install one more extension, Live Server. Live Server allows us to instantly preview our web page in the browser. The best part? We don't have to refresh the page every time we make a change. It updates automatically. These two extensions will make your coding experience much smoother as we move forward. Next, we need a web browser. I'll be using Google Chrome, but you can use any browser you prefer. I recommend Chrome because it's fast, reliable, and excellent for web development. Now, inside VS Code, we need to create a folder for our project. So, over here, under the Explorer panel, click on Open Folder. Then, I'll create a new folder. I'm going to name it HTML, but honestly, you can call it anything you like. Next, select that folder to open it inside VS Code. Now, inside this folder, let's create a new file and call it index.html. And here's something very important. The file extension at the end must be .html. That's what tells VS Code that this is an HTML file, and it also helps your web browser recognize it as a web page. It's also a good habit to name your homepage file index.html because when someone visits your website, the web server automatically looks for a file named index.html in the main directory. If it finds one, that's the page it shows first. So basically, index.html acts as the default homepage of your website. Alright, now at the top of our index.html file, we should always start with the doctype tag. So let's go ahead and type a left angle bracket. As you can see, VS Code gives us a suggestion list, and the first item you'll see there is doctype, short for document type. Press Enter or Tab and it will automatically add the doctype declaration for you. Now, this tells the web browser that the document we're writing is an HTML5 file. Next, we need to add the HTML tag. Notice how, when I type the opening tag in VS Code, it automatically creates the closing tag for me. So now we have both, the opening and the closing HTML tags. Most HTML elements follow this same pattern. They have an opening tag and a closing tag. But there are a few exceptions, and I'll show you those later in the course. Now, here's something important. The term element is what we use to describe each individual piece that makes up our HTML document. In other words, every tag you write, like a paragraph, a heading, or an image, is an HTML element. These elements are recognized by all major web browsers, which means they'll display correctly no matter which browser someone is using. Alright, now inside our HTML element, we're going to add a few more elements. The first one is the head tag, and the second one is the body tag. These two tags represent different sections of an HTML document. The head section is where we put information about the web page, things like the page title, links to CSS files, or metadata. And the body section is where we put everything that we want the user to actually see on the page. So all the visible content, like headings, paragraphs, images, links, and forms, goes inside the body. Basically, the body is where your entire web page comes to life. Inside the head section, let's add a title tag. Inside the title tag, let's type My First Web Page. Let's go ahead and save this file. Now, if you right-click anywhere inside the editor, you'll notice an option that says Open with Live Server. Click that, and VS Code will automatically open your web page in your browser so you can see the results instantly. As you can see, the page is totally empty right now. That's because we haven't put anything inside the body tag yet. But if you look up at the Browser tab, you'll notice the title we just added. It's showing up right there. If Live Server opens in a browser you don't want to use, don't worry, you can change it. Here's how. Go to File, Preferences, Settings. Then go to Extensions and scroll down until you find Live Server Config. Under Custom Browser, you can choose any browser you want Live Server to open with. Alright, now let's start adding some content to the body. First, we'll add a P tag, which stands for paragraph. Inside this P tag, let's type I like HTML. Now if we save this file and take a look in the browser, we'll see our text, I like HTML, displayed on the page. As you can see, I've been indenting these tags right here. This is actually a common convention when writing HTML. You don't have to do it, but it makes your code much easier to read and understand. To make formatting our code really simple, we're going to use the Prettier extension. It takes care of all the spacing and styling for us, so our code stays clean and easy to read. At the top, go to File, Preferences, Settings. Then, in the search bar, type Default Formatter. And select Prettier Code Formatter. We don't want to format our code manually every time we make a change. So instead, we can tell VS Code to automatically format our code whenever we save. To do that, search for Format on Save in the settings, and then turn it on by ticking the checkbox. So now, whenever we save the file, VS Code will clean up and format our code automatically with Prettier. No extra work needed. Now let's add another p tag. Inside this one, let's type Learning HTML is fun. And there we go. As you can see, we now have 2 paragraphs displayed on the web page. The next thing we're going to learn is how to inspect an element on a web page. All you need to do is right-click on a web page and choose Inspect. Once you do that, you'll see the HTML outline of the page. You can hover over any of these elements and you'll notice the corresponding part of the page gets highlighted on the screen. This whole panel that just opened is called Google Chrome's Developer Tools. There's a lot of really useful stuff in here that can help us build and debug websites. But for this course, you don't really need to worry about all that. As long as you know the basics of inspecting elements with DevTools, you'll be all set to follow along with this HTML course. Next, let's talk about HTML comments. Comments are a special syntax that helps us write notes in our code, or temporarily switch off parts of it without having to delete anything. So it looks like this. We start with opening angle brackets, followed by an exclamation point and 2 dashes. Then we put any code or text that we want the browser to ignore inside the comment. Finally, we close the comment with 2 dashes and a greater than sign. Let's say I want to add a note right here in the code. We can write a comment like this. This is the first paragraph. If we save it like this, you'll notice it actually shows up on the web page. Now, if we wrap it correctly as a comment, you'll notice VS Code displays it as green text. This is a hint that this text is commented out. So, when we save the file, we don't see it on the page, but it's still there in the document, just ignored by the browser. Alright, so that's one way we can use comments. But comments have another important use as well. Let's say we want to disable this second paragraph temporarily. This time, I'm going to show you a shortcut. If you're on Windows, press Ctrl and /, or on Mac, press Command and /. Now, if we save the file, you'll see that the second paragraph doesn't show up on the page. But notice, we haven't actually deleted it. With this method, we can easily restore it later if we want. So it's very different from actually deleting the code. So earlier, we learned how to create the basic HTML document structure by typing out each of these elements one by one. But there's actually a much simpler way to do this in VS Code. If I just type an exclamation point and then hit Tab, VS Code will automatically generate the entire HTML setup for me. This is called the HTML boilerplate, which basically means a starter template for your web page. Now, inside the head tags, you'll notice there are also some meta tags. These are just bits of metadata, extra information about our HTML document. The first one defines the character set, which tells the browser what kind of text encoding this page uses. Next, we have another meta tag that configures the viewport. The viewport is simply the visible area of a web page. We use this tag to make sure our web pages look good on all devices, whether it's a phone, tablet, or desktop. But for this course, you don't really have to worry about it. So I'm just going to delete those meta tags. Here you can see the lang attribute. This is used to tell search engines what language the web page is written in. Right now, it says the language is English. But for what we're doing in this course, it doesn't really matter, so you can go ahead and delete it if you want. Next up, we're going to learn about HTML headings. Alright, now let's talk about headings. In HTML, we have 6 different heading elements: H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, and H6. They're all used to create headings, but each one represents a different level. So let's try them out and see what we get. So this is what the real size of each heading looks like. So H1 represents the top level heading, and H6 represents the least important one. All of these headings get smaller in size as the number goes up, from H1 down to H6. Now, one common mistake I see a lot of people make is choosing heading tags based on their size. For example, if they want a smaller heading, they'll just use H3. But that's not how headings are meant to be used. You can change the font size anytime with CSS, so that's not what headings are for. Instead, we use headings to define the structure of our document. So there are a few important rules when it comes to using headings. The first rule is that you should only have one H1 tag in your document, because it represents the main topic or primary heading of your entire web page. After that, you can have H2 headings to represent subsections under that main topic. And according to HTML structure rules, you shouldn't use an H2 unless there's an H1 first. In other words, the headings on your page should follow a logical hierarchy: H1 first, then H2, then H3, and so on. This hierarchy helps organize your content, making it easier for both users and search engines to understand what your page is about. Proper use of heading tags not only improves readability, but also boosts your SEO, helping your page rank better on Google. Now let's learn about some of the most common elements we use to work with text in HTML. So earlier you learned about the paragraph element, which we use to display normal text. Here I'm going to type, HTML is very easy to learn. Now, let's say we want to emphasize a certain part of that text. For example, the word very. To do that, we can wrap it inside an M element, which stands for emphasis. So, whenever you want to emphasize a piece of content, you can use this element. All right, let's go ahead and save our changes. And here's the result we get. By default, the browser shows emphasized text in italic. But, and this is really important, you shouldn't use the M tag just to make something italic. The purpose of the M tag is to add meaning. It tells the browser, screen readers, and even search engines that this part of a sentence needs special emphasis or should be read with more stress. If you want to make text italic or bold only for visual style, that should be done with CSS, not HTML. Now we have another element called the strong element. We use the strong tag when we want to give a piece of text special importance or strong meaning. By default, browsers display text inside this tag in bold. In this sentence, I'm going to wrap the word HTML with the strong element. If we save the file, you'll notice in the browser that the word HTML is now bold. Just like with the M element, this isn't only about appearance, it's about meaning. The strong tag tells search engines and screen readers that this word carries extra importance in our content. Next, we've got two more text-based elements, superscript and subscript. In HTML, these are used to move text slightly above or below the normal line of text. They're super useful when you're writing math formulas, chemical equations, or footnotes. Let's take an example. Here we have this formula, but we actually want that to write it like this. So, to do that, we'll wrap the number 2 inside a sup tag. That's short for superscript. Let's save the file, and here's what we get. Now let's take a look at subscript. Subscript text is usually lowered below the baseline and appears a bit smaller than the regular text. For example, let's say we want to show this sentence on our web page. Here you can see the number 2 sits just below the regular text. To do this in HTML, we simply wrap the number 2 inside a sub tag, which stands for subscript. Alright, that's it for superscript and subscript. Pretty simple, right? They're small tags, but really handy when you're working with things like math formulas or chemical symbols. The next thing I'd like to show you is lists. In HTML, we have 3 main types of lists: an unordered list, an ordered list, and a description list. The one you'll use most often is the unordered list, written with the UL tag, which stands for unordered list. Inside that, we use LI elements, and LI stands for list item. Let's create a simple list of fruits. We're using an unordered list here because the order of the items doesn't matter. Now, if we save this and check the browser, you'll see that each list item appears with a bullet point in front of it. That's the default style for unordered lists, but remember, you can customize that later. You can change the bullet style, remove them entirely, or replace them with icons or images using CSS. The main idea behind an unordered list is that the order of items isn't important. And one of the most common uses for unordered lists is when you're building navigation menus on a website. Next, we have the second type of list, which is the ordered list. And this is used when the order of the items actually matters. So if you change the order, the meaning of the list could change too. Let's take an example. Let's say we want to show this list on our web page. Now, to create this kind of list, we use the OL tag, which stands for ordered list. Inside that, we'll add multiple LI elements for each list item. So in this case, we need 4 list items. There's actually a really handy shortcut for this in VS Code. We can type OL with right angle bracket. Then LI times 4, because we have 4 list items. Then hit Tab, and VS Code will automatically generate all the markup for us. Now we can start filling in each item. Let's go ahead and add the first one. Next, brush your teeth. After that, we have breakfast. Then finally, we'll add our last item, go to school. Now, if we save this and look at the browser, you'll see that each list item is automatically numbered for us. That's the default behavior of an ordered list in HTML. Now we have the third type of list, called a description list. This one's really useful for things like glossaries or metadata, where you want to show a term followed by some details or an explanation about that term. Let's look at an example. We start with the DL element. That stands for description list. Inside this list, we add a DT element, which means description term. So inside the DT tag, we'll write the word HTML. That's the term we're describing. Then, right after that, we'll use a DD element. That stands for description details. Here, we can write something like this. Now, let's add another description term. So, inside a new DT tag, we'll type CSS. Then, just like before, we can add a DD element to describe it. Alright, let's save this. And here we have our description list displayed on the page, with each term and its corresponding description neatly shown. Next, let's take a look at nested lists. You can nest lists using unordered lists, ordered lists, or even a mix of both. Nested lists are commonly used in things like menus or outlines. Let's see an example. We'll start with an unordered list, and our top-level items will be fruits and vegetables. After fruits, we'll add another unordered list inside it. Then I'm going to add 3 fruit names as the list items. Next, we'll do the same thing for vegetables. We'll create another unordered list and add a couple of vegetable names to it. Once we save this and check the browser, you'll see our nested list properly displayed. And that's it. That covers all the basics of lists in HTML. Next, we're going to move on and talk about hyperlinks. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to create hyperlinks. Almost every web page you visit has links that take you to other pages or websites. You can add a link to text, images, or even buttons. In HTML, we create links using the anchor element. Every anchor element needs an href attribute. href stands for Hypertext Reference, and it tells the browser where the link should go. For example, if we want to make a link that takes the user to Google, we put the full URL inside the href attribute. We must type the complete URL, otherwise the link won't work. So this tells the browser, when someone clicks this link, take them to Google. Next, inside the opening and closing anchor tags, we write the link text. This is the text the user will actually click, so it should clearly describe where the link leads. Once we save the file, we can click the link, and it will take us straight to google.com. Now, sometimes when we link to external websites, we might want the link to open in a new browser window or tab. To do that, we use the target attribute. Here, inside the target attribute, we need to type _blank. This tells the browser to open the link in a new page. Now, if we click this link, it will open the Google homepage in a new page, instead of replacing the current page. Now, let's say we want to link to another page on our own website. So I'm going to create a new HTML file and call it about.html. Inside this file, let's generate the HTML boilerplate. Just type an exclamation point and press Tab. Next, let's change the title to About. Then I'm going to add an h1 tag and type something like, "This is the About page." Next, go to the index file and let's add another anchor tag. Inside the href, we need to set the file path. Here, it's about .html because both files are in the same location. Now, let's give this link some text. Let's say, About Us. Let's save the file. And now, if we click this link, it'll take us straight to the About page. Currently, both of these pages are in the same folder. But in real projects, we don't always keep all our files in one place. For example, let's create a new folder called Pages and move our about.html file into it. Now our link will stop working because it's still looking for about.html in the same directory as index.html. To fix that, we need to tell the browser where to find it. So, inside the href, we'll type pages/about.html. Now if we save this, it will work again. That's because we've correctly told the browser to go inside the Pages folder and then look for the about.html file. There's another really useful way to use the anchor element. Instead of linking to a different web page, we can actually link to a specific section within the same document. Let's see how that works. First, I'll create two sections with a lot of text. We'll start with a heading. So I'll add an h1 element and call it Section 1. Then, let's add a paragraph of dummy text. To quickly generate placeholder text, we can just type lorem followed by the number of words we want. That'll create about 50 words of random Latin text, which is great for testing. Let's save this. And here's what we get on the page. Now let's add another section to our page. This time I'll use an h2 element and call it Section 2. Then let's add another paragraph with some text below it. When we save this, you'll see that Section 2 appears further down the page, so you have to scroll to see it. Instead, we can add a link at the top of the page that lets the user jump straight to Section 2 when clicked. To make that work, we first need to assign an ID to the element we want to link to. In this case, the h2 heading. So I'll add an ID attribute and set it to something like Section-2. The name of the ID doesn't really matter. You can call it whatever you want. It won't change how the page looks. It's simply a way for us to refer to that specific element from somewhere else in the document. Now on the top, we can add a link to the section 2. So, when the user clicks on that, they will immediately jump to the section 2. For the href, we'll type a £sign followed by the ID we set earlier, in this case, section-2. For the link text, let's type go to section 2. Now let's save the file. If we click this link, it takes us directly to the section 2 heading. Wherever that ID is found on the page, the browser will automatically scroll there. Just remember, each ID must be unique within a page. You can have as many IDs as you want, but no two elements should share the same one. We can also create links that open the user's email client to send a message. To do this, we use the mail to scheme in the href attribute. Let's add another anchor tag, and inside the href type mail to, followed by the email address you want to send to. For the link text, we can use something like email us. Now if we click this link, it will open the default email application on the computer or device and start composing a new email to the address we've set. In this lesson, we're going to learn how to add images to a web page. The first thing we need is an image. Here, I have an image that I downloaded from unsplash.com. It's a great website where you can find high-quality, copyright-free images that you can use in your projects. Inside the project folder, I'm going to create a new folder called Images. Now let's drop our image into this folder. Next, let's add the image element. The image element is a bit different from the other elements we've seen so far. It doesn't have any text content, and it doesn't have a closing tag. It's what we call a self-closing element. Here you can see it has two important attributes, source and alt. We use the source attribute to specify the path to our image. So here I'll type images, then a slash, and then the image name along with its file type. After we save the file, the image will appear on the web page. Next, we have the alt attribute. This stands for alternate text, and it should contain a short description of the image. This text isn't normally displayed on the page, but it's very important. It will show up if the image can't be found or fails to load. It's also crucial for accessibility. People who are visually impaired often use screen readers, which read the web page content out loud. So, this alternate text helps them understand what the image represents. That's why it's important to write a clear and meaningful description here. For this image, we can write something like, beautiful sunset over the ocean. This clearly describes what the image shows. Now, like I mentioned before, if the image can't load for some reason, the alt text will show up instead. Let's try that out. I'm going to slightly change the image file name so that the browser can't find it. Now, let's save the file. And as you can see, the image isn't showing up, but our alt text appears in its place. Every image you add to your web page should have alternative text, with one exception. That's when you're using decorative images. These are purely for design purposes and don't contain any meaningful information. For example, a background flourish or a purely decorative icon. In these cases, a visually impaired person using a screen reader won't miss anything important if they can't see the image. For example, if you look at Discord, you'll see decorative images there. These images are purely for design purposes. They don't contain any meaningful information. So if someone is using a screen reader, they won't be missing anything important by not seeing these images. So for decorative images, you can leave the alt attribute as empty quotes. This is still different from not having an alt attribute at all, which is not recommended. By the way, we don't have to use only images stored on our computer. We can also use images hosted online. For example, let's go to pixabay.com. It's another great resource for high-quality, copyright-free images. Once you find an image you like, you can copy its image address. Now we can paste that URL into the source attribute. After saving the file, you'll see the image from pixabay.com displayed on our page. However, I generally recommend keeping images locally on your computer. The reason is that online URLs can change or disappear, but if the image is saved locally, it will always be available for your website. We can also turn an image into a hyperlink. To do this, we simply wrap the image element inside an anchor tag. For example, let's say we want the user to go to Google when they click the image. Inside the href attribute of the anchor tag, we'll add the Google URL. Now, if we click the image, you'll see that it takes us directly to google.com. Next, we have the video and audio elements. To keep things organized, I created a new folder called Media. And inside that folder, I've placed two files I downloaded from pixabay.com. First, let's set up an audio player in the browser using the audio element. We also need to provide the location of the audio file. So here, the source will be media / then the audio name along with its file type. If we save this, you'll notice that nothing appears on the page. By default, when you create an audio element and provide a source, it won't play automatically when the page loads. To make it visible and usable, we need to add the controls attribute. This is a Boolean attribute, which means it doesn't need a value. Just adding it is enough. Now, if we save the file, we can see the audio player controls appear in the browser. With these controls, we can play the audio, change the volume, we can fast forward, or we can mute the sound. We also have the autoplay attribute. When you add this, the audio will automatically play when the user visits the page. We also have another attribute called loop. When you add this, the audio will automatically start over after it finishes playing. Next, there's the muted attribute. If we add this and play the audio, you'll see that it is playing, but we can't hear any sound because it's muted. Here, we can also add backup audio files in case the browser doesn't support a particular format. To do this, we can include multiple source elements inside the audio tag. Now we'll take the current source from the audio element and put it inside the first source tag. Then, if we have the same song in a different format, we can add it as a second source element. Here, I have the same audio file, but in a different format. This way, the browser will try the first source, and if it can't play it, it will move on to the next one. Finally, we can include a fallback message inside the audio tag that will display if none of the sources are supported. For example, let's say, your browser does not support HTML5 audio. And that's how you can add audio to a web page with backup support. Next, let's see how to add a video to a web page. To do this, we use the video element. First, let's set the source attribute to point to our video file. media/waterfall.mp4. Just like with audio, we'll also add the controls attribute so we can play, pause, and adjust the volume. The video element also supports autoplay, muted, and loop attributes, just like the audio element. Now, what if someone's browser doesn't support our video file type? We can provide a backup video in a different format. For example, I have a WebM version of the same video saved in my media folder. Inside the video tags, we can add a source element. We'll take the current source, cut it, and paste it inside the source tag. It's also a good idea to tell the browser the type of video file using the type attribute. To add a backup, we just use another source element and point it to the WebM version. This way, the browser will try the first video, and if it can't play it, it will move on to the next one. I'm going to delete the MP4 version of the waterfall video. As you can see, the video still plays. That's because the browser is using the WebM backup. If we try to download it, you'll notice the file type is WebM. Using this method, we can specify multiple video file types to make sure as many browsers as possible can play our video. And in case a user's browser doesn't support any of the provided formats, we can include a fallback message inside the video tags. For example, let's say, "Sorry, your browser doesn't support embedded video." This ensures the user sees a friendly message instead of a broken video. Now let's learn how to create HTML tables. Tables are a way to display information in rows and columns, basically in a tabular format. Now let's say we want to display this table on our web page. The first thing we need is the parent table element. All of our table content will go inside this table tag. Next, we define the rows of the table using the TR element, which stands for table row. Inside each TR element, we can have one or more cells. These cells can be either header cells or data cells. For example, let's look at this table. Here we have 4 rows and each row has 3 cells. The cells in the first row are called header cells because they contain labels that define what each column represents. All the other cells in the table are called data cells because they hold the actual data or information. Now let's go back to our code. In this row, we're going to add 3 data cells. To define a data cell, we use the TD element, which stands for table data. In the first data cell, I'm going to type MacBook Pro 16. Next, we'll define another cell for the product category. In this case, it's laptop. And finally, we need a third data cell for the product price. After that, we can go ahead and define the other 2 rows in the same way. Now let's save the file. Here's what we get: a simple table displayed on the page. And that's the basics of creating an HTML table. By default, the table doesn't have any styling, so it looks very plain. Now let's add a header row to our table. To do this, we'll add another TR element at the top of the table. In this row, we're going to add 3 header cells. To define a header cell, we use the TH element, which stands for table header. A quick way to create multiple header cells is to type TH 3 times. This will generate 3 header cells at once. In the first header cell, I'm going to type product name. And for the second header cell, I'm going to type category. For the third one, let's type price. Now, if we save this, you'll notice that the header cells are displayed in bold text and center aligned by default. Right now, it's hard to tell that this is a table. So let's make it clearer by adding a border. To do that, we can use the border attribute for the table. So here in the opening table tag, let's type border equals 1. If we save this file, here's what we get. But when we use this method, as you can see, every cell gets a border. Now we can change this look using 2 other HTML table attributes. They're called cell spacing and cell padding. We can use them to control the spacing inside and between table cells. Cell padding controls the space inside each cell. That's the space between the cell's content and its border. Think of it as inner padding for table cells. This adds extra space inside each cell, making the content look less cramped. Cell spacing controls the space between table cells. Think of it as outer spacing between cells. This creates visible gaps between the cells. So let's add them to our table. And please note, this part isn't required. It's only for improving the appearance of the table. Here, I'm going to say cell spacing equals 0 and cell padding equals 8. Now, when we save this, you'll notice that it actually looks like a table. Next, we've got 3 new table-related elements: T-head, T-body, and T-foot. These help you divide a table into different sections: the header, the main body, and sometimes a footer. This makes your table much easier to organise and work with. They're also super handy when it comes to styling your table, since you can target each section separately. Plus, using this structure makes your table more meaningful to search engines and more accessible for screen readers. Let's go ahead and update our existing table. Inside the table, we'll start by adding a T-head element, short for table head. Then, we'll move the first row inside the T-head element. Next, we'll define the body section of the table. Right after the T-head, we'll add a T-body element. Then, we'll move those 3 rows inside the T-body section. If we save this, you'll notice the output looks exactly the same as before. But now, our markup is more meaningful, both for search engines and for screen readers. This is what we call semantic HTML. Semantic simply means meaningful. Now let's talk about the caption element. This element adds a title or description for your table. It always needs to be the first element inside the table. So if you're going to use a caption, it should go right here at the top. For the caption, we'll type product price list, so it clearly describes what the table shows. Once we save the file, you'll notice that the caption appears at the top of the table, centered by default. Now let's talk about 2 important attributes: col span and row span. With these attributes, we can build table layouts just like the one you're seeing here. In this example, the utilities cell spans 2 rows and the total cell spans 2 columns. Also, if you look at the table header, monthly expenses spans across 3 columns. Now, I'm going to quickly set up the basic structure of this table. Now we have the table's basic skeleton set up, but if we save the file, you'll notice that the layout still isn't quite right yet. That's okay. Next, we'll fix it by using col span and row span to make the cells span the correct rows and columns. In this table, you can see the first row in the table header spans across all 3 columns. To do that, we use the col span attribute on the table header cell. By default, the value of col span is 1, but in this case, we need to set it to 3. The col span attribute determines how many columns a single cell should stretch across. And now, the monthly expenses column spans across all 3 columns in the table. Next, we have the utilities cell. In this case, we'll use the row span attribute. which allows a cell to extend vertically across 2 or more rows. So let's set it to 2. That means this particular cell will span 2 rows instead of just 1. Next, in the table footer, we want the total cell to span across multiple columns. To do this, we use the colSpan attribute again and set it to 2. This way, the total cell stretches across 2 columns, making it line up neatly with the data above. After saving the file, you'll see that our table is now neatly structured. And that's everything you need to know about HTML tables. In this lesson, we're going to talk about containers. Containers are used all the time in web pages. In HTML, there are a few different container elements, but the one you'll see most often is the div element. Now, the div itself doesn't have any visual appearance. If you save it and look at the page, you won't see anything. So why do we use it? We use div to group content together, which makes it easier to style or organize later with CSS. I'll add 3 paragraphs with dummy text inside this div. Now, let's say we want to add a border around these 3 paragraphs. We can do that easily by applying the border to this div element. Here, we can add a style attribute to the div. Let's say style equals border 2 pixels, solid, and border color is black. By wrapping these paragraphs in a div, we can apply a single border that groups them together visually. Sure, there are other elements we could use, but the div makes the most sense here because it's simple and flexible. Now let's look at the span element. It's kind of like div, but there's a difference. Don't worry, I'll explain it fully at the end of this lesson. Here, I'm going to wrap a span around these 2 words. Let's save it. And as you can see, just like with the div, there's no visual change yet. Suppose we only want to highlight these 2 words in a different color, leaving the rest of the paragraph unchanged. We can do that easily using the span element. Let's add a style attribute to the span and set the color we want. Let's make it red. Now you can see that these 2 words are red. We already know that HTML files are made up of lots of different tags or elements. Now, some of these elements are called inline elements and others are called block-level elements. The main difference between them is how they appear in the browser and how much space they take up on the page. So here's the difference between span and div. The span element adds markup to a portion of text in your document, while div defines a division of a document. Both are general-purpose containers. The key difference is that div is a block-level element and span is an inline element. Let me show you what I mean. I'm going to add a background color to this div. As you can see, the div fills up the entire width of the page, even though it has very little content. This is because block-level elements always start on a new line and take up all the available horizontal space. On the other hand, the span element is inline, which means it only takes up as much space as its content needs. To show how it works, we'll add a background color to this span element. You can see the color only applies to these 2 words. But if we change this span to a div, the background would stretch across the entire width of the page. So, block elements take up the entire width of a line, while inline elements only take up as much space as they need. Block elements always start on a new line, whereas inline elements sit right next to each other. You can even change their behavior using CSS if you want. In the previous lesson, we learned that divs and spans are general-purpose containers. But with HTML5, we got a bunch of new container elements that are more descriptive and meaningful. We call these semantic elements. Before these elements existed, web pages were packed with divs, basically generic containers all over the place. The browser had no real idea what kind of content was inside them. It could have been an article, a biography, or even navigation links. There was nothing to describe what that section actually was. HTML5 semantic elements were introduced to fix that problem and make our code more meaningful. So this is an example for semantic HTML structure. As you can see, using this structure helps the browser understand what each part of the page represents, like this is the navigation, this is the article, and this is the footer. It gives the browser a better idea of what the content actually is, making your HTML a lot more descriptive and meaningful. But they're still just containers. They don't have any special styling or behavior by default. They work exactly like divs, but they add meaning to our code. For example, when you see a main element, you instantly know that it represents the main content of the page. There are two big benefits to using semantic elements. The first one is accessibility. Semantic elements make websites easier to understand for screen readers and assistive technologies. When your page clearly says, "This is the main content," or "This is the navigation bar," it becomes much more user-friendly. The second reason is all about SEO, search engine optimization. Semantic elements help search engines understand your content better, which can improve how your site appears in search results. Just remember, these elements don't affect how your web page looks or behaves. They're all about making your HTML more meaningful, accessible, and search engine friendly. In this lesson, we're going to learn about a very important topic in HTML, forms. To create a form, we use the form element. Every form also includes an action attribute, which tells the browser where the form data should be sent when the user submits it. Since this course is really about learning form elements and how to structure our forms properly, we'll just remove the action attribute for now to keep things simple. Inside this form, we're going to include one or more input fields, also known as form controls. To add one, we use the input element. Every input needs a type, and if we set the type to text, the browser displays a single line text field. Here's what that looks like. Now we need to add a label for this input field. To do that, we use the label element, which lets us provide a clear name or description for the input. Inside the opening and closing label tags, we write the text we want to display. For example, if this input is for the username, we can simply type username inside the label. So when someone visits the web page, they'll see this label and understand that the input field is meant for entering their username. Every label also has a for attribute. This allows us to link the label to a specific input field. To do that, we give the input a unique ID, like username. Then we set the label's for attribute to match that exact ID. By using the same value in both places, the label becomes properly connected to the input field. Now, when we click on the label, the input field automatically gets focused. This makes the form easier to use and much more accessible for everyone. Now, let's add another input field for the password. Let's update the label text to password. This also needs to be updated to password. We should also update the input's ID to password and set its type to password. Now, if I type in this field, you won't see the actual characters. Instead, all the text appears as dots. Keep in mind this is just a visual mask. It doesn't make the input truly secure behind the scenes. So, right now our labels and inputs are sitting on the same line. If you want them on separate lines, just wrap each label and input pair in a div. Now, our form fields are laid out vertically. Now, let's add a Submit button to the form. Every button has a type. If we set it to Submit, the button will be used to submit the form. Between the opening and closing button tags, we type the text we want to display on the button, like Submit. Now, let's add another button to reset the form. Set the button's type to Reset. This button will clear all the values in the form. If I type something and then click Reset, the form is automatically cleared. Now, let's add another input field. Let's say this one is for the email. Set the type to Email and use Email as the ID as well. Let's update the label text to Email and change the labels for attribute to Email. Since the input's type is set to Email, the browser provides basic validation for this field. When we try to submit the form, it checks whether the value looks like an email address. If it doesn't include an @ sign, we'll see an error saying something like, "Please include an @ in the email address." Keep in mind, this doesn't verify whether the email is actually real, just that it's in the correct format. Now, let's take a look at the required attribute. Right now, all the form fields we've created are optional. I can submit the form even when the username, password, and email fields are empty. This is where the required attribute comes in. If you want to make sure a user can't leave a field empty, you can use the required attribute. To make our input fields required, we just add required to each field. No need for equals or any value. Now, if we try to submit the form without filling in the required fields, it won't go through. Next, let's talk about the name attribute in input fields. The main purpose of name is to give a label to the input's value when it gets sent to a server. So let's go ahead and add a name attribute to our 3 input fields. Now, if we submit this form, you'll notice in the browser URL that our data is being sent. In this course, we're not dealing with server-side stuff, so we won't actually process this data. But it's still important to know how forms send information, because this is how data gets from your page to a server in a real website. Now, these input fields also come with a few other useful attributes you should know about. One of them is value. We can use the value attribute to pre-populate an input field with some text. For example, I could set a default email for the email input by writing something like abc@example.com. Now, when the page loads, the email field is already filled in with that text. Another helpful attribute is placeholder. A placeholder lets us show some default hint text inside an input field, usually to tell the user what they're supposed to type. So let's add a placeholder to the username input. We can write placeholder equals username. Now, when the field is empty, you'll see that placeholder text. But as soon as you start typing, the placeholder disappears. Another useful attribute is read-only. When you add read-only to an input, the user can see the value inside the field, but they cannot change it. Let's say we want to make the email field read-only. To do that, we simply add the read-only attribute to the input, just like this. Read-only is a Boolean attribute, so we don't need to set it equal to anything. Just including it is enough to activate it. So in cases where you want to display a value, like an auto-generated ID or a fixed piece of information, you can set a value for the input and mark it as read-only. Another similar attribute is disabled. When an input is disabled, the user can't interact with it at all, not even select or focus on it. It's completely inactive. Let's go ahead and disable the email input. Once it's disabled, the user won't be able to click on it, type in it, or interact with it in any way. And when you submit the form, a disabled field's value won't be sent to the server at all. That's the key difference between read-only and disabled. A read-only field can't be edited, but its value will still be included when the form is submitted. Next, we have the max length attribute. This is another useful validation tool. If you want to limit how many characters a user can type, for example, in the password field, you can set a max length value. This ensures the user cannot type more than the allowed number of characters. If we set the max length to 10, the user can type up to 10 characters, but no more. So for the password field, this makes sure the input doesn't exceed 10 characters. Next, we have a new element called text area. We use a text area for longer messages or comments because it gives us a multi-line text box. If we save the file, here's what it looks like. It gives us a larger input area, and we can even resize it by dragging the corner like this. Now, let's add a label for this text area to identify what the user should type in it. So let's say this text area is for comments. We'll set both the ID and name attributes to comments. And we'll set the label's for attribute to comments as well. For a text area, we can control its size by setting the rows and cols attributes. So here, let's set rows equals 10. Setting it to 10 rows just controls the initial height of the text area. It doesn't limit the user to only 10 lines of text. They can still keep typing as much as they want. For the width, we can set the cols attribute. Let's say cols equals 50. That will make the text area wider, but again, it only affects the initial size, not how much the user can type. One thing to know about text areas is that, unlike input fields, they have both an opening and a closing tag. That means any text you place between those tags will appear inside the text area by default. To show you what I mean, I'll add some lorem ipsum text between the tags, and you'll see it preloaded in the text area when the page loads. Now you can see that our text area is pre-populated with the text we placed between the opening and closing text area tags. Now let's learn how to create checkboxes. We start by typing input and then choose the type as checkbox. Press enter and we have our checkbox input ready. For now, we don't need to add the name attribute since that's mainly used when submitting the form to a server. Once we save this, we can see a checkbox appear on the page. Next, it's important to add a label for the checkbox. This helps users understand what the checkbox represents and also improves accessibility. Now, let's give the checkbox an ID, for example, subscribe. Then we can associate the label with this checkbox by setting the label's for attribute to the same value. Let's set the label text to say, subscribe to our newsletter. And this is what it looks like. Now, when we link a label to a checkbox, clicking on the label will also check the box. Now, if we want the checkbox to be selected by default, we can add the checked attribute. Since checked is a Boolean attribute, we don't need to assign it a value. And here's what we get. Checkboxes can also be disabled, which means the user won't be able to interact with them. Let's take a look at how to create a drop-down list in HTML. To do that, we use the select element. Inside a select element, you can include multiple option elements. Let's say the user can choose their country from this drop-down menu. We should also add a label for it. Let's say country. Now, let's link the label with the drop-down. If we leave the first option empty, the drop-down becomes optional. Users don't have to pick a value. We can also use this first option to give a message like select your country. Next, we'll add some country names as the other options. Next, let's give each option its own value. These values are what will be sent to the server when the user submits the form. Let's save our changes and see the result. As you can see, the first option shows the message, select your country. Now, when we click the drop-down, we can choose another option like this. Now, let's say we want a country to be selected by default when the page first loads. To do that, we can use the selected attribute. For example, if we want the UK to be selected by default, we just add selected to that option. As you can see, this is a Boolean attribute. Now the UK is selected by default, and you can change it to something else if you want. We can also let the user select multiple options. It doesn't really make sense in this example, but I'll still show you how it works. In the select element, there's a Boolean attribute called multiple that enables this feature. So, if you're using a mouse to select these options, on Windows, you need to hold down the Control key, or Mac, you need to hold down the Command key on the keyboard. Sometimes, when a drop-down has too many options, we can organize them into categories using the option group element. So here, we add an option group element. And then we can place our option elements inside this option group to group them together. Now let's copy and paste this one more time. Next, let's change the option names and their values. Each group should have a label, so let's call this one North America. For the second group, we can call it Asia Pacific. Now, if we save this, here's what we get. Two groups, North America and Asia Pacific. And that's everything you need to know about drop-down lists. Next, we're going to learn about the radio button element. With checkboxes, users can select multiple items, but sometimes we want to limit them to choosing just one option. In these cases, we can use either a drop-down list or radio buttons. Let's create this. Here we have a group of radio buttons to select a payment method. You can only pick one because you only need a single payment method for a transaction. To create a radio button, we start by defining an input element with the type set to radio. Next, we'll add a label so it's clear what this radio button is for. For this radio button, we'll use Visa. Set the For attribute to match the radio button's ID and label it Visa. Now, let's wrap these in a div so we can stack all three radio buttons vertically. Now we need two more radio buttons. For the second one, I'll set the ID to MasterCard. Next, we'll change the label text and update its For attribute. Next, we'll set up the third radio button for PayPal. So we have three radio buttons. Right now, I can select all three because they aren't connected. To group them together, we use the Name attribute. We'll call it Payment Method. Next, let's assign the same name to the remaining two radio buttons. Now, all three belong to the same group. After saving, you'll see that only one radio button in the group can be chosen. Now, just like with checkboxes, if you want to pre-select a radio button, you can use the Checked attribute. You'll see that the second option is selected automatically. There's also a Disabled attribute that we can use. You'll see that this item is no longer selectable. We also have the Value attribute, which is used to send data to the server when a radio button is selected. In this example, it's not important because we aren't sending the value to the server. That's all for the radio button element. Next, we have a different type of input, the range input, which is essentially a numeric slider. To create it, we use an input element with the type set to range. At this point, we don't need the name or ID attributes. But we do want to set the min and max attributes. Let's set min to 0 and max to 10. And this is what it looks like. The slider starts at 0 on the left and goes up to 10 on the right. With a range input, you can't see the range or the current position by default. To show the current value, JavaScript is needed, which we won't cover here, but you can set the starting position using the value attribute. Let's set the initial value to 8. Now if we save this, you can see that it starts at this point. If I set it to 4, the slider starts here. That's how the range input works. Next, let's take a look at field sets. Now, let's talk about the field set element. This isn't an input or a form control. Instead, it's used to group related form controls together. As forms get more complex, it's helpful to organize related fields into logical sections. For example, here we have a user information form. Here, we can separate these elements using a field set. Let's group these 3 inputs into one section. To do that, we'll wrap them with a field set element. Inside the field set, we add a legend. The legend element explains what the grouping is for. It acts like a label or caption for the field set. For example, we can label this section User Personal Information. Here's what we get. This is the legend acting as the label for our group. Now, let's create another section for these elements. We'll call it Account Preferences. Now, as you can see, we have 2 sections. This is how we use the field set element. Not everyone uses it, but it's good to know about.